The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, shattering the early morning stillness as Hank Lawson stepped out onto the porch of his modest ranch house, his weathered hand gripping his Winchester rifle. The year was 1878, and the small Montana Territory settlement had seen its share of trouble, but none that had cut as deep as the wound Hank carried in his heart for the past 6 years. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Hank surveyed his land. At 32, he'd built something substantial from nothing, a thriving cattle operation that spanned 2,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land. The Rocking L Ranch employed 6 hands year-round and doubled that during roundup season. His cattle were the finest in the territory, his breeding stock sought after by ranchers from as far as Wyoming and Dakota Territory, but success had come at a price. The loneliness of his large ranch house reminded him daily of what he'd lost, or rather, who had left: Jenny Harrington. Even thinking her name sent a familiar ache through his chest. 6 years had passed since she disappeared from Redemption Creek without a word, leaving behind only whispered rumors and a broken engagement. Hank holstered his revolver and walked toward the barn. The morning chores wouldn't complete themselves, and dwelling on the past never changed it. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, spending the first year after Jenny left in a whiskey-soaked haze until his foreman, old Frank Dobson, had quite literally dragged him back to the land of the living. "Morning, boss," called Caleb, the youngest of his ranch hands, leading 2 saddled horses from the barn. "Heading out to check the north pasture fence line. That storm last night might have knocked down some posts." Hank nodded. "Take Will with you. There were wolf tracks near the creek yesterday." "Don't want you out there alone." As the young men rode off, Hank walked into the barn's cool shadows. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and horses greeted him constants in a world of change. He was reaching for a saddle when Frank appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Rider coming," Frank said, his voice oddly strained. "From town." Something in the old man's tone made Hank pause. "Problem." Frank shifted his weight, a nervous gesture Hank had rarely seen in the 15 years they'd worked together. You'd better come see for yourself." Hank followed Frank out into the yard, squinting against the morning sun. A single horse and rider were approaching down the long drive that connected the ranch to the main road. As the figure drew closer, Hank felt his breath catch in his throat. Despite the years, despite the distance, he'd have known that silhouette anywhere, Jenny Harrington, but she wasn't alone. Riding double with her, a small boy clutched her waist, his face partially hidden against her back. Hank stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. Jenny here, after all this time. The woman who had haunted his dreams for 6 long years was real, flesh and blood, approaching his home as if she'd never left. And the boy? Hank felt the world tilt beneath his feet as understanding crashed over him like a wave. The child appeared to be 5, maybe 6 years old. The timing. It couldn't be coincidence. "Frank," Hank said, his voice barely audible, "give us some privacy." The old foreman nodded solemnly and retreated toward the bunkhouse. Hank stood alone in the yard as Jenny reined her horse to a stop 20 feet away. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft nickering of her tired horse and the distant lowing of cattle. Jenny looked both familiar and strange. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back beneath a practical riding hat, her face more angular than he remembered, with fine lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before. But her eyes, those deep blue eyes that had captivated him from the first moment they'd met, were unchanged. "Hello, Hank," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands as she gripped the reins. Jenny. Her name felt strange on his lips after so long. Thousands of imagined conversations with her had played out in his mind over the years, but now that she was here, words failed him. The boy peered around her side, studying Hank with solemn eyes that were unmistakably like his own. The child had Hank's strong jawline and the same cowlick at his temple that Hank had fought with every morning of his life. "This is Henry," Jenny said softly. "Your son." The world seemed to hold its breath in the silence that followed. A son. He had a son. The implications of those 3 words crashed through Hank's mind, bringing with them a flood of emotions he couldn't begin to sort through. "Why now?" he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. 6 years, Jenny. 6 years without a word." She dismounted carefully, helping the boy down after her. Henry stood close to his mother, one small hand clutching the fabric of her riding skirt, but his gaze remained fixed on Hank with an intensity that was unsettling in one so young. "I know I owe you explanations," Jenny said, "more than I can give standing here in your yard." She glanced down at Henry and then back to Hank. "But I had my reasons for leaving, and I have my reasons for coming back. Good reasons, Hank." "Ma says you have horses," the boy said suddenly, his voice clear and confident despite his apparent shyness. "Big ones." The simple statement, so unexpected, broke something loose in Hank's chest. He found himself kneeling down to the boy's eye level. "That's right, I have 28 horses. Work horses, riding horses, and even a few that aren't good for much except eating grain and looking pretty." Henry's solemn expression gave way to a small smile. "I like horses. Ma taught me to ride when I was 4. Did she now?" Hank glanced up at Jenny, who was watching their interaction with shimmering eyes. "Your ma was always the finest rider in the territory. Bet she didn't tell you she could outride most of the men around here." The boy's eyes widened. "Even you." A genuine laugh escaped Hank for what felt like the first time in years. "Especially me. She beat me in the Independence Day race 3 years running." Henry seemed to consider this information carefully before nodding with approval. "Can I see your horses?" Hank stood, feeling oddly unsteady. "Sure, but maybe your ma and you would like to come inside first, rest a bit, have something to eat." Jenny's relief was visible. She'd clearly been uncertain of her reception. "That would be welcome. It's been a long journey." As they walked toward the house, Hank felt as though he were moving through a dream. The woman he had loved, had mourned, had eventually forced himself to forget, was walking beside him. And between them walked living proof of what they had once been to each other. Frank appeared as they approached the house, tactfully keeping his distance but close enough to receive instructions. Hank called out, "Frank, see to their horse, would you? And let Mrs. Pearson know we have guests for lunch." The old foreman tipped his hat to Jenny. "Miss Harrington." "Good to see you again, Mr. Dobson." Jenny nodded politely. "It's been a long time." Frank's weathered face softened as he looked at Henry. "And who might this young man be?" "This is Henry," Hank said, the words still feeling strange in his mouth. "Henry, this is Mr. Dobson. He helps me run the ranch." "Do you ride horses too?" Henry asked seriously. Frank chuckled. "Every day for 50 years, son. Reckon I've forgotten more about horses than most men ever learn." The boy seemed to consider this a satisfactory answer and followed his mother as Hank led them into the house. The main room was spacious and comfortable, if somewhat Spartan. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, while practical furniture was arranged to take advantage of both warmth and the view through the large windows. The walls held a few hunting trophies and practical items, a rifle rack, maps of the territory, and a single landscape painting that had been a gift from a grateful rancher whose herd Hank had helped save during a brutal winter storm. Jenny paused just inside the door, her gaze sweeping the room. "You finished it," she said softly. "The house, it's just as you described it would be." Hank felt a twist in his gut. This house had been meant for them, designed with Jenny's input, built with the expectation of a future together. "Had to live somewhere," he said more gruffly than he intended. "Please, sit down. Mrs. Pearson will bring something to eat soon." As if summoned by her name, the housekeeper appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Mrs. Pearson had been with Hank for 4 years, a widow from town who had needed employment and whose cooking had probably saved Hank from starvation during his darker periods. "Well, I never," she exclaimed, her eyes widening at the sight of Jenny. Unlike Frank, Mrs. Pearson had never met Jenny, but Hank suspected the housekeeper had heard plenty about her from the ranch hands. "Mrs. Pearson, this is Jenny Harrington and her son, Henry. They'll be joining us for lunch. Perhaps you could prepare something. They've had a long journey." "Of course, Mr. Lawson. I have stew that's nearly ready, and I baked fresh bread this morning." She smiled warmly at Henry. "And I believe there might be some molasses cookies that need eating." Henry's face brightened, but he looked to his mother for permission. "Thank you, Mrs. Pearson," Jenny said. "That sounds wonderful." As the housekeeper bustled back to the kitchen, an awkward silence fell over the room. Henry, sensing the tension, wandered to the window to look out at the ranch yard. "Where have you been?" Hank asked quietly, mindful of the boy's presence but unable to contain the question any longer. Jenny's hands twisted in her lap. "Colorado, mostly. Denver for a while, then a small town called Silver Creek. I found work as a schoolteacher." "You left without a word, Jenny." "Not a letter, not a message. Nothing." She met his gaze directly. "I know, and I'm sorry for the pain that caused you, but I had my reasons, Hank." "What reasons could possibly justify? Ma says my grandfather was a bad man," Henry interrupted, turning from the window. "She says he wanted to hurt her, so we had to hide." Hank stared at the boy, then at Jenny, whose face had gone pale. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenny closed her eyes briefly. "Henry, why don't you see if Mrs. Pearson needs help in the kitchen? Maybe she'll let you have a cookie before lunch." The boy looked between the adults, clearly sensing the gravity of the conversation, but the lure of cookies proved stronger than curiosity. After he disappeared into the kitchen, Jenny turned back to Hank. "My father found out about us," she said quietly. "About the baby, he wasn't the man people in town thought he was. Behind closed doors, he was violent, controlling. When I told him I was going to marry you, that I was carrying your child, he threatened to kill you, and I believed him." Hank felt as though he'd been struck. Josiah Harrington had been one of the wealthiest men in the territory, a banker and investor who owned half the businesses in Redemption Creek. He'd made no secret of his disapproval of Hank, considering a rancher beneath his daughter's station. "But threats of murder? Why didn't you tell me? We could have faced him together." Jenny shook her head. "You didn't know him like I did, Hank. He had connections everywhere, judges, marshals, hired guns. He would have found a way to destroy you legally, or he would have had you killed and made it look like an accident." Her voice broke. "I couldn't risk it, not with our baby coming, so I ran. And you never thought to send word. All these years, I thought." He couldn't finish the sentence. "I wanted to," she whispered. "So many times I started letters to you, but I was terrified he would somehow track me through them. He had the resources to do it." Hank ran a hand over his face, struggling to process everything. "Your father died 2 years ago, Jenny. The whole town knows it." "Why wait until now to come back?" She looked down at her hands. "I didn't know he had died until 3 months ago. I was careful never to maintain connections to Redemption Creek, afraid he would find us. It was only by chance that I encountered a cattle buyer from Montana who mentioned it in passing." She looked up, her eyes glistening. "Once I knew he was gone, I started making arrangements to return. It took time." Hank stood and walked to the window, needing space to think. Outside, ranch life continued, men moving between buildings, horses in the corral, chickens pecking in the yard. The normalcy of it seemed surreal against the upheaval happening inside these walls. "Henry doesn't know about me," he asked finally. "He knows you're his father," Jenny said. "I've never lied to him about that. I've told him stories about you, about the ranch, about the life we were supposed to have together. But he's never met you, so it's all been abstract to him." "And now, what do you want now, Jenny?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with 6 years of separation and unspoken grief. "I want him to know his father," she said simply. "Beyond that, I don't know. I have no right to expect anything from you, Hank. I understand if you're angry, if you can't forgive what I did. Before he could respond, Henry reappeared, a cookie in hand and a smudge of molasses on his cheek. Mrs. Pearson says lunch is ready, he announced. She made biscuits, too. Hank managed a smile. Well, we'd better not keep her waiting then. Her biscuits are famous in these parts. As they moved toward the dining room, Hank felt a small hand slip into his. Looking down in surprise, he met Henry's earnest gaze. Ma says you have the best horses in the territory, the boy said seriously. Will you show me after lunch? Something shifted in Hank's chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in years spreading through him. I'd like that very much, Henry. The dining room, like the rest of the house, was practical rather than ostentatious. A solid oak table that could seat 12 dominated the space, though Hank typically ate alone or with Frank when discussing ranch business. Today, Mrs. Pearson had set 3 places at one end, with her best china and even a small vase of wildflowers as a centerpiece. Lunch was a curious affair. Henry, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents between the adults, chatted freely about the journey from Colorado, the animals they'd seen along the way, and his fascination with a book about dinosaur bones he'd received for his last birthday. Jenny remained quiet, offering gentle corrections or elaborations when Henry's storytelling veered into exaggeration. Hank found himself studying the boy, noting the familiar gestures and expressions that mirrored his own. The way Henry's brow furrowed when he concentrated, the slight tilt of his head when listening intently, all reflections of himself at that age, according to his mother before she passed. Do you like being a rancher? Henry asked suddenly, fixing Hank with those disconcertingly direct eyes. I do, Hank answered honestly. It's hard work, and sometimes the weather or sickness in the herd makes it challenging, but there's something about watching over the land and animals that feels right. Could I learn to be a rancher? The innocent question lodged in Hank's throat like a stone. Before he could formulate a response, Jenny interjected gently. Henry, remember what we discussed. We're visiting to get to know Mr. Lawson. We need to take things one step at a time. The boy's face fell slightly. But you said he's my pa. An uncomfortable silence descended on the table. Hank cleared his throat. Tell you what, Henry, why don't we start with that tour of the horses I promised? Then maybe, if it's all right with your mother, you could help me and Frank check on the new calves in the east pasture. Henry's expression brightened immediately. Can I, Ma, please? Jenny hesitated, then nodded. Just be careful and listen to everything Mr. Lawson tells you. I will. Henry jumped up from his chair, then remembered his manners and looked sheepishly at his mother. May I be excused? Jenny smiled. Yes, you may. Thank Mrs. Pearson for the wonderful lunch. After the boy had dutifully thanked the housekeeper and raced outside, Jenny and Hank were left alone at the table. The silence between them felt different now, less hostile, more weighted with unspoken possibilities. He's a good boy, Hank said finally. You've done well with him. Jenny's eyes filled with tears. He's so much like you, not just in looks but in spirit, so curious about everything, so determined. She wiped at her eyes. Every day with him I saw you, it was both a comfort and a heartache. Hank reached across the table and, after a moment's hesitation, covered her hand with his own. I wish things had been different. I wish you had trusted me enough to tell me the truth. I was young and terrified, she said. My father had controlled every aspect of my life. When I met you, fell in love with you, it was the first time I'd ever defied him. I didn't understand then that I could stand up to him, that we could face him together. She turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that felt both familiar and new. I've regretted that decision every day for 6 years. Hank felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. Where are you staying? In town, she nodded. At Mrs. Miller's boarding house. We arrived yesterday evening. That's no place for a child, he said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. It's cramped and she overcharges for meals. It's only temporary. I've been corresponding with Mr. Peterson about teaching positions. The town has grown enough to need a second teacher. Hank hesitated, then made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. "Stay here," he said. "Both of you, the house is big enough. There are several empty bedrooms upstairs." Jenny's eyes widened. "Hank, I couldn't, he's my son," Hank interrupted, the words feeling more real with each passing moment. "I've missed 6 years of his life. I don't want to miss any more because you're staying in town and I'm out here." He squeezed her hand. "Besides, it would give us time to figure out. Whatever this is now." Hope flickered across her face, quickly tempered with caution. "Are you sure? The gossip, let them talk," Hank said with a decisiveness that surprised him. "This is my land, my house, and Henry is my son. What happens here is our business, no one else's." Before Jenny could respond, they heard excited footsteps on the porch, and Henry burst back into the room. "Mr. Dobson says there's a new foal in the barn. Can we see it before the other horses?" Hank laughed, the sound coming easier than it had in years. "I suppose we'd better." "New foals wait for no man." He stood and looked at Jenny. "Think about what I said. No rush to decide." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "We'll talk more later." The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Henry proved to be an enthusiastic and attentive student as Hank introduced him to the various horses, explaining each one's name, temperament, and purpose on the ranch. The boy was particularly taken with Thunderbolt, Hank's personal mount, a powerful black stallion with a white blaze down his face. "He's so big," Henry exclaimed, reaching up tentatively to stroke the horse's neck after Hank lifted him high enough. "He is that," Hank agreed, "but gentle when he needs to be. A good horse knows when to be strong and when to be kind. Like a good person." Henry asked, displaying a perception that belied his years. Hank smiled. "Exactly like that." They moved on to the calving pasture, where several new additions to the herd were testing their wobbly legs under the watchful eyes of their mothers. Henry asked endless questions why the calves were kept separate from the main herd, how old they needed to be before branding, what happened during roundup. Hank answered each question patiently, finding unexpected joy in the boy's curiosity. It was strange how natural it felt, sharing his knowledge with his son. His son. The thought no longer seemed quite so overwhelming. As the afternoon waned, they returned to the house to find Jenny on the porch with Mrs. Pearson, the two women talking quietly as they shelled peas. Jenny looked up as they approached, and something in her expression made Hank's heart skip. She looked at peace, as if some of the weight she'd been carrying had lifted. "Did you enjoy seeing the ranch?" she asked Henry. The boy nodded enthusiastically. "Mr. Dobson let me sit on his horse. And I saw baby cows, and Mr. Lawson says I can help feed the chickens tomorrow morning." Jenny raised an eyebrow at Hank. "Tomorrow, if you're amenable to staying," he said quietly. "The offer stands." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll need to collect our things from town." "I'll send one of the hands with a wagon," Hank said, unable to keep the satisfaction from his voice. "Frank can drive you into town now, if you'd like." As arrangements were made, and Henry chatted excitedly with Mrs. Pearson about helping with dinner, Hank found a moment alone with Jenny. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice low. "It's a lot to adjust to all at once." Hank looked out over his land, the setting sun painting the distant mountains gold and crimson. 6 years ago, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. Finding out I have a son that you're back, it's more than I ever dared hope for." He turned to her, allowing her to see the emotion in his eyes. "I don't know what the future holds for us, Jenny, but I want the chance to find out." She reached up and, with infinite gentleness, touched his cheek. "So do I." The ride into town with Frank was quiet. Henry, exhausted from the excitement of the day, dozed against Jenny's side in the wagon, while Frank kept his eyes on the road, tactfully giving Jenny space with her thoughts. Redemption Creek had grown in her absence. New buildings lined the main street, and a proper church steeple now rose above the town center. As they pulled up to Mrs. Miller's boarding house, Jenny felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. This town had once been her prison, ruled by her father's influence. Now it represented a possible future, one she'd scarcely allowed herself to imagine. "I'll wait here, Miss Harrington," Frank said as he helped her down from the wagon. "Take your time gathering your things." Inside, Mrs. Miller expressed surprise at their early departure, but asked no questions beyond offering to refund the unused portion of Jenny's payment. Within an hour, their modest belongings were packed and loaded onto the wagon, and they were heading back to the rocking L. Henry, who had woken refreshed, peppered Frank with questions about ranch life. The old foreman, initially reserved, gradually warmed to the boy's earnest interest, eventually sharing stories of the early days when he and Hank had first established the ranch. "Your pa was just 23 when he staked his claim," Frank told Henry. "Youngest man I'd ever seen try to start a spread that size. Most folks in town gave him 6 months before he'd fail." "But he didn't fail," Henry said with certainty. Frank chuckled. "No, son, he surely didn't. Worked harder than any 2 men I've ever known. Built something fine out of nothing but determination and grit." Jenny listened silently, her heart aching for all the years Hank had missed with his son, all the stories that should have been shared around a family dinner table rather than relayed by a foreman to a virtual stranger. When they returned to the ranch, Hank was waiting on the porch. He'd changed his clothes, Jenny noticed, and had clearly made an effort to tidy himself up. The gesture touched her deeply. "Welcome back," he said, helping first Henry and then Jenny down from the wagon. "Mrs. Pearson has dinner almost ready, and she's prepared rooms for both of you upstairs." The evening passed in a strange domesticity that felt both foreign and familiar to Jenny. Henry, despite his earlier nap, began to droop over his plate as the hour grew late. When his head nearly landed in his apple pie, Jenny announced it was bedtime. "I'll show you to your rooms," Hank offered, leading them upstairs. The upper floor of the house contained 5 bedrooms and a small sitting area. Hank had given Henry a room next to Jenny's, both located at the opposite end of the hall from the master bedroom. "I thought Henry might like this one," Hank said, opening a door to reveal a pleasant room with a view of the mountains. "It gets good morning light." The room had clearly been hastily prepared, but was comfortable nonetheless, with a single bed, a small desk, and a chest of drawers. Mrs. Pearson had placed a pitcher of water and a basin on the desk, along with a small vase of wildflowers. "It's perfect," Jenny said, helping a sleepy Henry prepare for bed. "Thank you." Once Henry was tucked in, his eyes already closing, Jenny and Hank stepped into the hallway. "Your room is here," he said, indicating the door next to Henry's. "I hope it's comfortable. It hasn't been used much." Jenny smiled at his obvious nervousness. "I'm sure it's lovely, Hank." They stood awkwardly in the hallway, neither quite ready to part for the night but uncertain how to proceed. "It's strange," Hank said finally. "Having you here in this house, I built it with you in mind, you know. Every room, every window placement, I wanted you to love it." "I would have," she said softly. "I do." He took a step closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and the underlying essence that was uniquely Hank. "I never stopped loving you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I tried, God knows I tried. But even when I thought you'd left me for someone else, even when I was angry enough to burn the world down, I loved you." Jenny felt tears well in her eyes. "I never stopped loving you either. Every day away from you was a day incomplete." Hank's hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as if he feared she might vanish again. "We have a lot to figure out, Jenny, a lot of lost time to make up for, but I want you to know I'm glad you came back. I'm glad you brought our son home." She leaned into his touch, allowing herself to feel the hope that had been building since that morning. "So am I." For a moment, it seemed he might kiss her, but instead he stepped back, his hand falling away. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will bring plenty of time to talk." Jenny nodded, understanding his restraint. They both needed time to adjust, to rebuild trust, to learn each other again. "Good night, Hank." "Good night, Jenny." As she closed her bedroom door behind her, Jenny felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in 6 long years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever bridges needed mending, they would face them together. She was home. The following weeks established a rhythm to their new life together. Henry, with the resilience of childhood, adapted quickly to ranch life. Each morning found him eager to help with chores, whether feeding chickens with Mrs. Pearson, gathering eggs, or accompanying Hank on his rounds of the property. The boy soaked up knowledge like a sponge, his natural affinity for horses and cattle making him a favorite among the ranch hands. Jenny found her own place within the household. Though initially uncertain of her role, she soon began assisting Mrs. Pearson with cooking and household management, freeing the older woman to focus on other tasks. In the afternoons, she worked with Henry on his lessons, maintaining his education even as they settled into their new life. Hank watched this domestic transformation of his home with wonder and gratitude. The house that had for so long felt empty and purposeless now hummed with life. The sound of Henry's laughter echoing through the rooms, the sight of Jenny's shawl draped over a chair or her books stacked on a side table, these small details grounded him, made the ranch feel truly like home for the first time. Their relationship progressed cautiously. Evenings were spent together on the porch or in the sitting room, talking long after Henry had gone to bed. They shared the stories of their years apart, Hank's struggle to build the ranch into a successful operation, Jenny's experiences as a teacher in Colorado. Slowly, the gulf of their separation narrowed. Physical intimacy developed gradually as well. It began with tentative touches, hands brushing while passing a plate at dinner, shoulders touching as they sat side by side on the porch swing. The first time Hank kissed her, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, it was a gentle, questioning press of lips that quickly deepened into something more urgent, 6 years of longing expressed in a single embrace. They had agreed to move slowly for Henry's sake, to ensure he had time to bond with Hank before any dramatic changes occurred in their relationship. But as the weeks passed, it became increasingly clear to everyone, including Henry, that his parents were falling in love all over again. "Are you going to marry my ma?" Henry asked one afternoon as he helped Hank repair a section of fence. The straightforward question, delivered with the boy's characteristic directness, caught Hank off guard. "Would you be all right with that if I did?" Hank countered, watching his son's face carefully. Henry hammered a nail with focused concentration before answering. "Yes, then you'd really be my pa, not just, you know." Hank set down his tools and knelt to meet his son's eyes. "Henry, I am really your pa. A piece of paper or a ceremony doesn't change that. You're my son no matter what happens between your mother and me." The boy considered this solemnly. "But you love her, I can tell." Hank smiled. "Yes, I do, very much. And she loves you. She looks at you the way Mrs. Peterson looks at Mr. Peterson in town." Henry made a slightly disgusted face. All soft and smiley. Laughing, Hank ruffled his son's hair. "Is that so? Well, I suppose that's a good sign then. So you will marry her." Hank picked up his hammer again, hiding his smile. "I might, if she'll have me, but that's between your ma and me for now, all right?" Henry nodded, satisfied with this answer, and returned to his task of holding the board steady. That evening, after Henry was asleep, Hank related the conversation to Jenny as they sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "He's certainly direct," Jenny said, laughing softly. "No beating around the bush for that one." "Wonder where he gets that from," Hank teased, his arm draped comfortably around her shoulders. Jenny leaned into his embrace. "Certainly not from his diplomatic father." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the gentle creaking of the swing and the distant sounds of night creatures the only interruption. "He's right, though," Hank said finally. "I do love you. Never stopped, not really." Jenny turned to face him, her expression serious in the lamplight spilling from the window. I love you too, through everything that never changed. Hank took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I've been thinking about what Henry asked, about marriage. Have you now? Her tone was light, but he could hear the underlying emotion. I know it's fast. We've only been back in each other's lives for a few weeks, but in some ways, it feels like we're picking up threads that were dropped 6 years ago. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. I don't want to rush you, Jenny, but I also don't want to waste any more time than we already have. She touched his face, her fingers gentle against his beard. Ask me properly, Hank Lawson, when you're ready, and I promise I'll say yes. The kiss they shared then was a promise of forgiveness for the past and hope for the future. As summer progressed into fall, life at the Rocking L settled into a comfortable pattern. Henry started attending the town school, riding in with Hank or one of the ranch hands each morning and returning in the afternoon. His quick mind and friendly nature made him popular with both teachers and students, and he thrived in the structured environment. Jenny, meanwhile, had accepted a position as the second teacher at the school, working 3 days a week with the younger children. The arrangement allowed her to maintain her connection to teaching while still having time for home and family. The town's reaction to Jenny's return and the revelation of Henry's parentage had been predictably mixed. Some, particularly those who remembered her father's controlling nature, were sympathetic to her situation. Others found plenty to gossip about, though most kept their opinions to themselves when Hank was present. Mrs. Caldwell actually had the nerve to ask if we were planning to legitimize our situation. Jenny told Hank one evening, her tone more amused than offended. Right there in the mercantile, with Henry standing not 3 feet away. Hank's jaw tightened. What did you tell her? That our family arrangements were private and not open for public discussion. Jenny smiled mischievously. Then Henry informed her that his pa was teaching him to ride Thunderbolt, and did she know that Thunderbolt was the fastest horse in the territory? Completely changed the subject. Hank laughed, shaking his head. That boy has better timing than a Swiss watch. He certainly knows how to manage difficult situations, Jenny agreed, but it does make me think, perhaps we shouldn't wait too much longer, for Henry's sake if nothing else. Hank caught her meaning immediately. Are you saying you're ready to make things official? She nodded, her eyes soft in the firelight. I am, if you are. I've been ready for 6 years, he said quietly, just waiting for you to come home. The following Sunday, after church services, Hank approached Reverend Thomas and made arrangements for a wedding to be held in 2 weeks' time. The news spread quickly through the small community, and despite the lingering gossip, most reacted with genuine happiness for the couple. Preparations consumed the ranch in the days that followed. Mrs. Pearson threw herself into planning the wedding feast, while Frank organized the ranch hands to construct additional tables and seating for guests in the yard. Jenny, with help from several women in town, worked on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of cream-colored silk with lace trim. Henry approached the upcoming ceremony with characteristic seriousness, practicing his role as ring-bearer with diligent concentration. He had taken to calling Hank Pa in recent weeks, a development that never failed to bring a lump to Hank's throat. The night before the wedding, after Henry was asleep, Hank found Jenny on the porch, gazing out at the star-filled sky, having second thoughts. He asked, only half joking as he joined her on the swing. She shook her head, smiling. Not about marrying you, never that. Her expression grew more thoughtful. I was just thinking about how different everything could have been. If I'd been braver 6 years ago, if I'd trusted you enough to stand with me against my father. Don't, Hank said gently, taking her hand. We can't change the past, Jenny. All we can do is make the most of now, of the future we have ahead of us. You're right. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. And it is a bright future, isn't it? You, me, Henry, our family. The brightest, he agreed, kissing the top of her head. though it might get brighter still in time. She looked up at him, understanding his meaning. More children. If you want them, if we're blessed that way. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. I'd like Henry to have brothers and sisters. So would I, she said softly. Very much. They sat together in comfortable silence, contemplating the future that lay before them, a future neither had dared hope for just months ago. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, a perfect early October morning. The ranch was transformed for the occasion, with bunting and flowers decorating the yard and house. Guests began arriving mid-morning, neighboring ranchers, townspeople, and even a few of Jenny's former students from Colorado who had made the journey north for the occasion. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. Henry performed his duties with solemn dignity, presenting the rings at the appropriate moment without prompting. Jenny, radiant in her cream silk dress, and Hank, unusually formal in a new suit, spoke their vows with clear voices that carried across the gathered crowd. I, Hank Lawson, take you, Jenny Harrington, to be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. As Jenny repeated the same vows, her voice strong and sure, Hank felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The long, lonely years of separation fell away, replaced by the certainty that this woman, this family, was his true north, the center around which his world would turn for all the days to come. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests seemed to echo Hank's own joy. He kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied the passion simmering beneath, mindful of their audience, but unable to completely hide the depth of his feelings. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Lawson, Henry darted forward to stand between them, grabbing each of their hands. The spontaneous gesture drew laughter and a few damp eyes from the crowd. But to Hank, it was the perfect symbol of their new beginning, not just as husband and wife, but as a complete family at last. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of food, prepared by Mrs. Pearson and the neighboring ranchers' wives. A small band from town provided music for dancing, and even the most reserved guests found themselves tapping their feet to the lively tunes. As night fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a warm glow over the continuing festivities. Hank found a moment of quiet with his new wife, drawing her away from the crowd to the relative privacy of the barn. "Happy, Mrs. Lawson?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. Jenny's smile was luminous in the dim light. "Happier than I ever thought possible." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Thank you for forgiving me, Hank, for giving us this second chance." "Nothing to forgive," he said, pulling her closer. "You did what you thought was right to protect our son. I might have done the same in your position." Still, these years we lost, he silenced her with a kiss, pouring all his love and commitment into the embrace. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "We have all the years ahead of us," he whispered against her lips. "Let's make them count." Their private moment was interrupted by the appearance of Henry, who had been sent to find them by an increasingly anxious Mrs. Pearson. "Ma, Pa." "Mrs. Pearson says it's time to cut the cake, and Mr. Dobson says the Johnsons need to leave soon to get back to their ranch before it's too late, and everyone's waiting for you." The boys' excited report tumbled out in one breath. Hank laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "Tell them we're coming right now, partner." As Henry raced back to deliver the message, Jenny slipped her hand into Hank's. "Our son is quite the little messenger." "Our son," Hank repeated, savoring the words. "I like the sound of that." Hand in hand, they returned to their wedding celebration, to the friends and neighbors who had gathered to witness their union. And to the future they would build together on the land Hank had claimed so many years ago, a future now infinitely richer for the presence of the family he had almost lost forever. In the years that followed, The Rocking L Ranch prospered under Hank's steady guidance. The cattle operation expanded, acquiring additional grazing lands to the north and establishing the Lawson brand as one of the most respected in the territory. Jenny continued teaching part-time while managing the growing household, finding satisfaction in balancing her professional interests with family life. Henry grew tall and strong, his natural affinity for ranch work developing into genuine skill under his father's tutelage. By the time he was 12, he could ride as well as any hand on the place and had a particular gift for working with difficult horses, a talent Hank encouraged with pride. The family expanded as well. 2 years after their wedding, Jenny gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Hank's mother. Ellie, as she was quickly nicknamed, inherited her mother's honey-brown hair and her father's determined spirit. She was followed 3 years later by another son, James, a quiet, thoughtful child with an unexpected talent for drawing that emerged as he grew. Their home became the heart of the community, hosting gatherings for holidays and special occasions. The annual 4th of July celebration at the Rocking L grew famous throughout the county, drawing visitors from as far as 50 miles away for the barbecue, games, and fireworks that Hank imported specially from Denver. Through it all, Hank and Jenny's bond deepened and strengthened. The trials they had faced before their reunion had forged a resilience in their relationship that saw them through the inevitable challenges of ranching life drought years, harsh winters, fluctuating cattle prices. They faced each obstacle as partners, their shared history providing perspective that helped them weather difficult times. On the 10th anniversary of Jenny's return, the family gathered on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of gold and crimson. Ellie, now 8, sat on the steps playing cat's cradle with 6-year-old James, while Henry, nearly 16 and almost as tall as his father, leaned against the porch railing, whittling a piece of wood with the pocket knife Hank had given him for his birthday. "What are you thinking?" Jenny asked softly, leaning against Hank's side as they sat on the swing. He smiled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "I was thinking how different this evening might have been if you hadn't found the courage to come back that day." She followed his gaze to their children, her expression reflective. "I almost didn't, you know. I was terrified you would turn us away, that you'd be too angry to forgive what I'd done." "Never," he said, kissing the top of her head. "I might have been angry, hurt even, but I would never have turned away my own child, or the woman I loved." "I know that now," she sighed contentedly. "We've built something beautiful here, haven't we? Something that will last." Hank nodded, his eyes moving from his children to the prosperous ranch, spread out before them the sturdy barn and outbuildings, the healthy cattle grazing in the distance, the fields of hay ripening in the summer sun. But more than the physical manifestations of their success, he valued the intangible legacy they were creating. A family bound by love and forgiveness, resilient enough to withstand whatever challenges the future might bring. "We have," he agreed. "Something to be proud of, something to pass on." From the yard came the sound of Henry's laughter as he set aside his whittling to show James a proper lasso technique. The younger boy watched with rapt attention as his older brother demonstrated, his small face serious with concentration. "Pa, watch this." Henry called, executing a perfect throw that captured a fence post 20 feet away. "Well done," Hank called back, pride evident in his voice. "Now let your brother try." As the children continued their impromptu lesson, Jenny turned to Hank, her eyes soft with love. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For waiting, for being the man I always knew you were, for giving our children this life." He cupped her face in his hand, still marveling at how time had only enhanced her beauty. The girl he had fallen in love with had matured into a woman of strength and grace, and his admiration for her grew with each passing year. "I should be thanking you," he said, "for coming back, for trusting me enough to try again." "Best decision I ever made," she whispered, leaning in to kiss him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land they had nurtured together, Hank reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the heartbreak of Jenny's disappearance to the shock of her return with their son, through the careful rebuilding of trust and the joy of expanding their family, each step had been necessary to create the life they now shared. The boy who had stood beside Jenny that fateful day was now nearly a man, with his father's features and his mother's kind heart. The understanding that had dawned on Hank in that first moment of recognition that he was a father, that Jenny had carried their child away to protect him, had evolved into a deeper appreciation of family's complexity and resilience. "I love you, Jenny Lawson," he said, the words as true now as they had been when first spoken years ago. "And I love you, Hank Lawson," she replied, her smile reflecting the peace they had found together. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come." As darkness settled over the rocking L Ranch, the Lawson family gathered close, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future might hold, they would face it together, a legacy born of second chances and enduring love, stronger for having been tested, and destined to flourish for generations to come.